December 31st, 1918. In a world not unlike our own, the great city of Darkwater, a vibrant maritime metropolis on the central coast of Massachusetts, prepares to celebrate the coming of a new year. The end of the Great War sees thousands of migrants flee the shattered ruins of Europe, seeking redemption in the land of opportunity. The slums of Darkwater are packed with Italian, Irish, and Eastern European immigrants, their labor leached by tyrannical factory owners who swell their already sizable fortunes. The rot of crime and corruption infests every facet of daily life. Fanatical gangs of thuggish criminals prey on the weakest of citizens, while cultish secret societies of the super-rich remain aloof to the overwhelming problems of poverty and pollution. Yet just outside Darkwater Port, as the city's occupants revel in the New Year's festivities, something rumbles in the deep, briny depths of the ocean. From out of nowhere, a huge, roaring tidal wave rose from the surging waters, smashing into the city and its unsuspecting denizens. Thousands disappear without a trace in the oceanic maelstrom of rushing water and debris. But as the great wave subsides and slips back into the ocean, strange things are left behind amongst the waterlogged carcass of Darkwater City. Ancient, mysterious artifacts churned up from the ocean floor. Eldritch creatures that long slumbered in the deep, dark depths. Over the next 6 months, broken survivors were rejoined by those that had managed to escape the disaster. Those that returned in the summer of 1919 found their city to be very different than when they had left it. A ubiquitous fog hung in the air, obscuring sodden streets and arterial alleyways. Strange figures lurked among the darkened ruins of the city's abandoned financial district, while from sewer grates, menacing, bestial howls emanated from the deepest recesses of the underground waterways. But there were less hideous things left behind by the great crashing tidal wave. Opulent treasures and priceless artifacts from some sunken civilization, riches so vast that the world has not seen its kind in millennia. Soon the city was once again overrun by criminal gangs, this time joined by a legion of mercenaries and bounty hunters, in the pay of those fat cats who wished only to reclaim their lofty domain, while the city's poor eke out a living among the rotten, jetsam-strewn remnants. This is where my story begins. My name is Skip Walters, a journalist for the local newspaper, known as the Darkwater Chronicle. I've returned to my hometown seeking to uncover the dark, murky secrets left behind by the Great Wave, as well as the shady dealings of the city's returning population, and those of the poor souls left behind. No stories too dangerous for this reporter, no enigma too vexing, no puzzle too confounding. I will not tire in my quest to bring you the latest news and stories from the darkest, most deadly city in America. Which brings me to my first tale. One of furtive dealings and fatal consequences with a twist of oceanic mysticism. Allow me to tell you the story of the Jamestown murders. Across the Carron River, just north of downtown Darkwater, lies the historic district of Jamestown. The roots of the predominantly Irish neighborhood go back to 1620, when it was first occupied by English settlers during the reign of King James I. However, the huge influx of Irish immigrants escaping the famine of 1840s are what gives Jamestown the demographic it has today. Mrs. Mary O'Dwyer is a descendant of just those people. A hard-working steedore's wife, Mrs. O'Dwyer lost her husband when the Great Wave crashed down into their small family home and swept the poor Mr. O'Dwyer away. Distraught, she sought refuge with relatives in New York for a few months, while repair and reconstruction efforts were prepared and put into motion. Her return was not a joyous one. The Great Wave had left her home a sodden wreck, and for the brief time she lived there, her existence was a tough one. With no work available and no husband to support her, Mrs. O'Dwyer was reliant solely on the charity of others. Re-emergent businesses, such as a local baker or diners, found themselves receiving weekly visits from the widow O'Dwyer, her cheeks pale and sodden, as she begged for weekly alms. Then, just last week, some terrible twist of fate, Mrs. O'Dwyer was viciously murdered in her own home. Her slaying coincided with the murder of another woman from the same Jamestown neighborhood, just a few nights prior. Police arrested a friend of Mrs. O'Dwyer's late husband in connection with her murder, given that he was the last person to see her alive. The situation didn't add up. Why would a dead man's friend murder his widow in such a savage, violent manner? There was only one thing for it. I threw on my overcoat and headed on over to Jamestown Police Precinct. An old friend still owed me a favor. The Jamestown Police Precinct is housed in an intimidating neo-Gothic building that still bears the scars of the Great Wave. Crowned with the skeletal pieces of wreckage from structures that didn't survive the disaster, the precinct is haunted by that smell of rot and brine that these days seems to plague the entire city. At first, my coincidental contact was hesitant to talk. The murders were a major police priority, and any leaks to the press would surely be met with a harsh punishment. But I had come prepared. A fifth of his favorite Irish whiskey was all it took to loosen the man's jaw. As he began to talk, my suspicions were confirmed. He, too, doubted the guilt of the suspect in custody.
I don't like him for the murders,
the anonymous officer confessed.
I've seen some killers in my time, and this guy, he ain't no killer. He keeps talking about a book that the victim found before she died. Only, he gets really scared when he does. Just locks up, starts talking to us for a while. We searched the house, found a ton of books, but none of them like the one the suspect described.
I confirmed the address of the O'Dwyer house, and then headed over to talk to the neighbors of the deceased. If anyone had heard Mrs. O'Dwyer mention this mysterious old tome, it'd be them. The O'Dwyers lived just a short walk from an area of Jamestown known as the Gallows Hill, famous for being the location of a huge stone obelisk that marks the site of a well-known Revolutionary War battle. I had not set foot in Jamestown since the Great Wave, let alone visited Gallows Hill. I found the obelisk intact, but it was now somewhat different to what I remembered. The previously bare stone of the monument was now completely covered in vegetation, thousands of creeping vines with knife-shaped leaves that snaked all the way up to its peak. It was unlike any kind of plant life I'd ever seen before, muddy green tendrils pulsing, glistening in the dull light of a cloudy afternoon. One of the residents, still in the process of cleaning out his home, eyed the monument nervously as he worked. After locating the O'Dwyer house, I knocked on a neighbor's door. Locks clattered and clicked before opening just a sliver. An elderly woman's weathered face peered out from the other side. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm from the Darkwater Chronicle. I wonder if I could have a moment of your time." I adopted a chipper tone, hoping to rid the woman of any nervous disposition. "You want to know about the murders, don't you?" Her weary blue eyes spoke of the Great Wave, and all the horror that it had wrought. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. "I just have a few questions for you regarding the untimely death of Mrs. O'Dwyer." The woman sighed, stepped back from the door, and welcomed me inside. She had evidently kept a neat and tidy home before the Great Wave, but despite her best efforts, her home still felt damp, and patches of mold were forming on sodden sections of wallpaper, the home pervaded by that ever-present scent of salt and rot. Over cups of hot tea, Mrs. Rosa Farley politely answered my queries to the best of her abilities. She explained that they had not seen or heard anything unusual in the night of the murders, but Mrs. O'Dwyer had not received any visitors on the evening in question. However, she did reveal that the other murder victim was in fact a friend of Mrs. O'Dwyer's that had visited the widow on the night she was killed. Despite being a few nights apart, it appeared the two murders were indeed connected. "She was worried about Mary. We all were," Mrs. Farley began, sipping hot tea from the porcelain cup that she held with her frail fingers. "Her mind was deteriorating, you know. Ever since she lost her husband to the Great Wave, she just wasn't the same. At first, it was just a melancholy that plagued her. She seemed crushed by the loss. But the day after I helped her clean out the house, that's when she started to talk to herself. Mary's friend tried to talk to her, to convince her to return to her relatives in New York. She didn't take that well. Not well at all." "Do you think Mrs. O'Dwyer was driven mad with grief?" I asked, scribbling in a small notebook as the woman spoke. "Maybe. I can't imagine a person could suffer that kind of loss and remain unscathed." I solemnly agreed, taking one last sip of hot tea before placing my notebook back in my coat pocket. Just one more thing. You don't happen to know anything about a book that Mrs. O'Dwyer had come into possession of before she was murdered?" Mrs. Farley froze in her seat. giving me a look that was deeply unsettling.
I was waiting for you to ask me that, Mr. Walters.
Her tone was full of dread as she spoke.
Yes, there was a book. We found it when we were cleaning out the mess that the wave had left. An old book, bound in black whale skin, pages that felt like thin sheets of leather. I asked Mary what the book was, but it appeared that she had never seen it before.
Where's the book now?
I don't know.
She shook her head, eyes filled with anguish as she maintained eye contact.
But it was only after we found that book that Mary began to act so strangely. Her appetite returned, her mood lifted, she was full of life again. People said she was whispering to herself, seeing things that weren't there, but I know otherwise. She wasn't talking to herself, Mr. Walters. She was talking to her dead husband.
And how could you possibly know that? I asked in confusion. Mrs. Farley leaned across the table, her pale blue eyes seething with intensity.
Because, Mr. Walters, the woman hissed. She told me so.
Late that afternoon, I headed over to the Darkwater coroner's office, nestled in a leafy street in the south end of the city. The doctor that had performed the autopsy on Mrs. O'Dwyer and her deceased friend was a wizened-looking man named Dr. Rothstein, wisps of white facial hair and small round glasses that framed exhausted-looking eyes. Dr. Rothstein was doing the best he could in the worst of conditions. I must be honest, I am a little confused when the police informed me that the foul play was suspected in their deaths, the doctor confessed, stroking his chin as he spoke. When I inspected the woman's remains, my first thought was some kind of animal attack. They were in such a terrible state they had to be identified by their dental records. But surely a strong enough person, someone consumed by rage, they could make a real mess of someone if they wanted to, right? I asked. The doctor paused before he spoke.
Have you ever been to see Mr. Walters?
Slowly his gaze met mine. I shook my head.
I have. I was the chief medical officer of a trade ship anchored off the coast of French Guiana. Men were swimming in the water when one of them screamed. The crew said he was dragged under by something. They managed to fight the thing off, but the poor man was left with the most horrific wounds on his torso, like they were infected by the suckered tentacles of a giant squid.
Where are you going with this, doctor?
The police wouldn't listen, but I saw those exact wounds on this woman's body.
Night had fallen by the time I made it back to my small, dingy apartment in Beacon Hill. The neighborhood's natural elevation meant that it had gotten off lightly when the great wave struck, but I was afflicted by the same familiar stench, along with the air of damp now pervaded. The flames of old-fashioned gas lanterns flickered in the darkness, throwing shadows over the skeletal tree limbs that had grown twisted since the Great Wave. This isn't the place that I had come to know before the tragic New Year's Eve. It was like a broken copy of the place. A madman's warped vision of the city I had grown up in. Reaching my apartment building, I climbed the step flights of carpeted stairs, my feet aching from the day's walking. Yet, as I reached my front door, I noticed a small envelope attached to it. In it was a small handwritten note. Darkwater Docks, midnight. I know what happened to Mary O'Dwyer. Darkwater Docks is only a short walk from my place in Beacon Hill. I was exhausted, worn out from the day's travel and tense questioning, but I had to know the truth. I gulped down a cup of coffee, grabbed a fresh pack of cigarettes from my writing desk, and headed back out into the night. About halfway into the journey, the faintest of noises broke the silence of the night. I slowed my footsteps, straining my ears to locate the source, but after taking a few steps, I was surprised to find that it seemed to be emanating from beneath my feet. I looked down to see a manhole cover, blocking the entrance to one of Darkwater's vast sanitation networks. Kneeling down, trying to get an idea of just what was making that sound, a feeling of distant unease came over me. The sound was a familiar one, or at least I knew what it reminded me of. It was the unmistakable skittering of sewer rats. Only the depth and pitch of it was all wrong. If I was correct, these vermin must have been huge, 4 or 5 times the size of a regular rodent. I jumped back when the heavy steel of the manhole cover grated against the damp concrete around it. It had moved. The grinding sounded again. The manhole cover shifted ominously, moved by some unseen force. Primal fear stabbed through my guts like a sharpened blade, and I began to flee the scene as the manhole cover rattled beneath me. If whatever was down there really did want to break through the surface, then I did not want to be around when it did. When I finally reached the docks, I found them utterly deserted. Nothing stirred in the dead of night. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the edge of the dock. I wandered around for a while, wondering if the risk of heading out into the new dark water night was going to be worth it. And suddenly, out of the inky black shadows of a warehouse building, he appeared. Wearing a green raincoat, black fisherman's hat casting a shadow over his face. He took a few slow steps towards me. You left me a message. It was all I could think to say.
I did,
the fisherman said. His voice was like gravel, a distinct twang to it.
And you came. Let's talk.
Who are you? More of a demand than a question.
That's not important, he replied. What's important is that your readers know what happened to Miss O'Dwyer.
And then, what happened to her?
Miss O'Dwyer was a poor, unfortunate soul. Came across something that she couldn't possibly understand.
The fisherman began.
You know what I'm talking about? That book she found. Only it's not a book in the truest sense. You don't read this book, it reads you.
Do you know what happened to Mrs. O'Dwyer's friend? The one killed a few nights before?
Aye. She knew what Mary found was a bad thing. She tried to make the women see sense. But anyone who happens upon that kind of power never gives it up easily.
What do you mean, power? What is that book?
Something old. As old as the ocean itself. Created by eldritch beings from the skins of a long-dead race. Its use requires skill, which Mary did not possess.
But her neighbor said she was talking with her departed husband. Are you saying she used that book to commune with the dead?
It's true that Mrs. O'Dwyer believed she was talking to her dead husband. That's unfortunately not the case. What she was communicating with merely assumed the shape of a dead loved one. To hide its true form, to manipulate her, toyed with her, then ended her life on a whim.
I was dumbstruck.
This city is different now. You know that, don't you, Mr. Walters? You feel it. I feel it. Everyone feels it. The great wave came and went, but it left pieces of itself all over. Pieces that people will struggle to comprehend. You have a duty now, Mr. Walters, to inform your readers, to warn them of the dangers that now exist in this once titanic city.
What are you on about? And what about you? I finally asked. What's your part in all this?
To guide the ship to calmer waters,
he said, the moonlight catching a thin smile.
To keep watch as this city enters a terrible new chapter in its history. Stay safe, Mr. Walters.
With that, he slipped back into the shadows, cloaked by the veil of night. The man arrested on suspicion of Mrs. O'Dwyer's murder, Seamus Toner, had been released without charge. Due to lack of evidence, Darkwater Police Department was unable to form a case against him, and he's since returned to his home in Jamestown. Mr. Toner declined to give an interview for the Chronicle, but I believe we've gathered enough information to form a loose picture of what happened to the woman, now known to some as the Jamestown Witch. The fisherman was right. Darkwater has changed in ways we can't even imagine. The horrors Mrs. O'Dwyer experienced will not be the last time one of us encounters the malevolence left behind in the aftermath of the tragedy that befell this city. But we survived the Great Wave. We'll survive what comes next. What's more, the Darkwater Chronicle will continue to report on all the new and terrifying dangers that now lurk in the dark corner of our once mighty metropolis. But until next time, readers, beware the unfamiliar, protect those dearest to you, and keep your eyes on the tides.